A millionaire CEO spotted a lonely little girl on an airport floor. He never guessed she'd change his life forever. Ryan Hale was used to moving through crowded spaces without letting anything slow him down. Airports were just another backdrop to his relentless schedule, a place where he could check emails, approve budgets, and prepare for meetings while thousands of people hurried past, none of them daring to interrupt him. That morning, as he stepped through the automatic doors into the main terminal, he wore the same light blue suit that had become almost a uniform, his hair precisely combed, his expression carefully composed. He carried himself like a man who had no reason to doubt he belonged exactly where he was, in control of every situation and insulated from anything that did not concern his business. The flight he was waiting for was due to bring in potential investors whose signatures could finalize a deal worth more money than most people would see in their lifetimes, and he had every intention of greeting them with the polished confidence they expected. He barely registered the other travelers around him, parents trying to calm overtired toddlers, couples embracing in tearful reunions, and tourists anxiously studying the departure boards. All of it blended into a single background hum. He kept his gaze focused straight ahead, walking briskly across the gleaming floor toward the private lounge where he planned to wait in peace. But as he passed one of the long rows of plastic chairs, something caught the edge of his vision, a small, motionless figure on the floor. He felt an involuntary flicker of irritation at the distraction, but something about the way the child was sitting made him stop without meaning to. At first, he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. She was so tiny that she seemed almost swallowed by the space around her, sitting cross-legged with her arms wrapped tightly around a pink backpack pressed against her chest. Her dress was white, slightly wrinkled, and a white headband with a bow held back a curtain of soft brown hair. She wasn't crying or calling out. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, her big brown eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond him, as if she were too tired or too frightened to look for help anymore. Ryan stood there for a moment, aware of the steady stream of people weaving around him, annoyed that he was standing still for no clear reason. He tried to tell himself that someone else would come along, a parent, an airport employee, anyone better qualified to deal with a lost child. But no one came. The seconds stretched longer, and the girl didn't move or even blink. He felt a faint memory stir at the edges of his mind, something he hadn't thought about in years, the feeling of being very small and very alone in a place full of strangers, wishing someone would notice he was afraid. He felt his chest tighten, though he didn't quite understand why. Slowly, he stepped closer and crouched down so that his face was level with hers. He expected her to flinch away, but she only shifted her gaze slightly to look at him with an expression so solemn it made his throat feel tight. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than he meant it to be. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The girl didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened around the backpack, and he noticed how her knuckles had gone white with the pressure. He waited, trying to keep his expression as calm as possible. Finally, in a voice so thin he had to lean closer to hear, she whispered, "I lost my mommy." The words were so soft, so final, that he couldn't think of anything to say. For the first time in years, Ryan Hale felt completely unprepared for what came next. Ryan stayed crouched in front of the girl, feeling the edge of the world he knew tilt just slightly out of place. For a moment, neither of them moved. He could hear the rolling suitcases bumping over tile behind him, the crackle of announcements echoing overhead, and the low murmur of voices that didn't belong to this quiet space between them. But the girl didn't look away. She watched him with an expression that was too steady, too resigned for a child so small. He realized he had never seen anyone look so alone. He cleared his throat again, searching for something that would make this moment less unbearable, something that would reassure her without making a promise he couldn't keep. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone hurrying toward them, waving anxiously, but no one came. The other travelers streamed past as if she were invisible. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low so she wouldn't feel he was scolding her. She hesitated, then opened her mouth, the word coming out in a whisper that trembled at the edges. "Sophie," she said. Her fingers fumbled at the zipper of the backpack, as if she were trying to find something inside it to prove who she was or where she belonged. He waited, letting her move at her own pace, and after a moment, she pulled out a small laminated card on a string. It looked like the kind of ID parents clip to children's clothes for safety, but it had twisted around itself so many times that it was nearly impossible to read. He took it gently from her hand and smoothed it out against his palm. Her first name was printed in large letters, but the emergency contact information was smeared and illegible. He felt something cold in his chest when he realized that if he walked away, she had no way of telling anyone more. He looked back at her and saw that she was watching him, waiting to see whether he would get up and leave like everyone else. He thought about how easy it would be to stand, to signal an airport employee, to hand off the responsibility to someone trained for this exact situation. It would be reasonable, expected even. But he couldn't make himself do it. He set the card down carefully on her lap and tried to smile. "All right, Sophie," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" She blinked, her lashes glistening as if she were about to cry, but she didn't look away. He glanced around again and spotted an information counter about 30 feet away, manned by a uniformed woman with a headset. The thought of carrying Sophie over there felt strangely daunting, like crossing a gulf he hadn't prepared himself to navigate. He knew he could call security to escort them, but that seemed like the wrong kind of attention, something that might frighten her more. So instead, he did the one thing that felt instinctive, something he couldn't imagine doing for anyone else. He reached out both arms, palms up, so she would understand she could choose whether to come to him. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, and he thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she lifted her small hands and rested them against his shoulders, letting him pick her up. She was featherlight, all warm limbs and trembling breath, and as he stood, she pressed her face into his collar. He felt her sigh against his neck, so soft it broke something open in him that he didn't have a name for. Carrying her across the terminal felt surreal. Dozens of people turned to look as he passed, probably wondering why a man in an immaculate suit was cradling a child with a pink backpack and white bow. He ignored every curious glance. He realized he no longer cared how it looked or whether he appeared out of place. At the counter, the woman behind the desk raised her brows in confusion. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked in a tone that suggested she was prepared to call security if necessary. Ryan nodded but kept his voice calm. "This little girl lost her mother," he said. "I need help locating her immediately." Sophie didn't lift her face from his shoulder. He felt her tiny fingers clutching the lapel of his jacket like she was afraid he might set her down and vanish. He rested a hand lightly against her back, as much to steady himself as to comfort her. The woman began typing on her keyboard, asking routine questions about flight numbers and boarding passes. Each question made it painfully clear that Sophie couldn't answer any of them. When the woman asked him if he was a relative, he heard himself say, "No," though it felt strange to admit out loud. "No, but I'm staying with her," he added, before he could stop himself. The woman looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face, and something in the way she studied him seemed to soften. She nodded once and picked up the phone to call the airport medical office. As she spoke in a low, efficient voice, Ryan shifted Sophie higher in his arms, feeling her weight settle against his chest. For the first time in years, he realized he didn't have any plan or script to follow. He only knew that he wasn't going to leave until he knew she was safe. The woman behind the counter spoke quietly into her headset, her voice low and professional, as she relayed what little information they had about Sophie's mother. Ryan stood beside her, feeling every second stretch out longer than the last. He adjusted his hold on the child to keep her balanced against his chest, surprised by how natural it felt to steady her small frame with one hand. Sophie still hadn't lifted her head. Her breath came in short, uneven sighs that dampened the collar of his shirt, and every time she exhaled, he felt a quiet pull in the center of his chest, something he had never felt in any boardroom or negotiation. He realized that the measured calm he wore like armor was cracking in places he hadn't thought possible. The dispatcher finally lowered her headset and met his gaze with a look that was almost gentle. "They found her mother," she said carefully. "She collapsed near the boarding gates, and the paramedics have already transported her to the airport clinic. From what I was told, she was conscious when they moved her, but they've taken her for further treatment to be safe." Ryan tried to process the relief that washed over him, but the sensation was immediately followed by a sharper awareness of how alone Sophie still was. He looked down at the little girl, trying to imagine what it must feel like to wake up in an unfamiliar place and not know if the person you loved most in the world would ever come back. He felt her shift slightly against his shoulder, and then, as though she finally couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer, she lifted her head. Her eyes were red around the edges but dry, and she looked up at him without blinking. "Is Mommy coming back?" she asked, her voice so small it barely reached past the space between them. The question pierced through every layer of practiced composure he'd built over years of learning how to stay detached. He thought about all the times he had refused to let himself get involved in other people's lives, convinced that it was weakness to care about something he couldn't fix with money or authority. In that moment, none of those convictions mattered. He felt a weight settle in his chest that he knew wasn't just responsibility, it was something closer to a promise. He met her gaze steadily, forcing himself to answer with the same honesty he would expect if it were his own child asking. "Your mommy is getting help," he said carefully. "She's very sick, but the doctors are with her now, and they'll do everything they can to help her feel better." Sophie studied his face for a long time, searching for any sign that he was only telling her what she wanted to hear. When she didn't look away, he realized she was braver than most of the grown men he'd done business with. After a moment, she rested her cheek against his shoulder again and didn't say anything else. He looked back at the dispatcher. "I'd like to see where they've taken her," he said, and though he knew it wasn't really his place to make demands, the woman only nodded as if she understood this was no longer about official procedure. They led him through a staff corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. His polished shoes clicked against the linoleum in a rhythm that felt much too loud, reminding him with every step that this was a world he had never had to inhabit. Sophie held onto his lapel with one hand, her grip tightening each time they turned a corner. When they reached the clinic, a nurse came out to meet them, her expression open and reassuring. "She's stable," the nurse said softly. "Exhaustion and dehydration, mostly. But we're running tests to be sure. It might be a little while before she wakes up fully." Ryan nodded, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. He looked at Sophie, wondering if she understood any of the words, but she was watching the nurse with a wary, hopeful expression. He hesitated before speaking again. "Can she wait here with her mother?" he asked. The nurse shook her head. "It's best if she stays in the family waiting area for now," she said gently. "It's quieter there, and we'll come get you as soon as her mother wakes up." He looked down at Sophie, who was still clinging to him like he was the only solid thing left in the world. Something inside him settled, and he knew without question that he wasn't going to leave her alone in that waiting room. He nodded once, feeling more sure than he had about anything in years. "All right," he said. "Then we'll wait." When the nurse gestured to a small hallway lined with plastic chairs, he carried Sophie to the nearest seat and eased himself down. She curled up in his lap without hesitation, her cheek pressed to his chest, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. As her breathing slowed and her eyelids drooped, he realized he hadn't thought about work or meetings or anything else since the moment he found her sitting alone. All he could think about was that he had never felt more certain he was exactly where he was supposed to be. For a long while, Ryan didn't move from that hard plastic chair. He sat with Sophie curled in his lap, her small frame warm against his chest, and watched the clock on the opposite wall tick off each slow minute. Every time he shifted or tried to stretch out his legs, she stirred in her light doze, her hand tightening in the fabric of his suit jacket. He didn't have the heart to disturb her, so he stayed exactly as he was, letting the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders. The steady rise and fall of her breathing felt almost like an anchor in a world that suddenly seemed full of things he couldn't control or predict. He had never realized how much easier it was to keep life compartmentalized, to draw clean lines between business and everything else, until those lines had dissolved without warning. A nurse came by twice to check on them, each time offering to bring Sophie something to eat or to take her to a quieter room where she could lie down, but Ryan only thanked her and declined. He could tell that the nurse was trying to be tactful when she glanced from his expensive watch to the tired set of his shoulders, as if she expected any minute he would pass the child to someone else and excuse himself back to whatever important work he'd left behind. The truth was he couldn't have left if he tried. He knew that whatever board meeting or contract negotiation he was supposed to be attending by now was irrelevant compared to this small life pressed so trustingly into his arms. After nearly an hour, Sophie lifted her head. Her eyes were still puffy from the earlier tears, and she looked around with a lost expression that made his chest tighten. She blinked up at him as if she was trying to remember why he was still there, why he hadn't disappeared like everyone else. He smoothed her hair back gently from her forehead and gave her the calmest look he could manage. "Your mommy is still resting," he said in the same voice he might have used to reassure a frightened client. "But the nurses are taking care of her. You don't have to be scared." She didn't reply, only shifted in his lap so she could bury her face against his shoulder again. Her trust was so simple and complete that it left him feeling unsteady. He realized then that he didn't even know if she'd eaten. He asked one of the nurses if there was any food appropriate for a child her age, and when a small tray arrived, apple slices, crackers, and a paper cup of juice, he tried to coax her to eat. At first, she only shook her head, so he broke a cracker in half and held it out in his palm until, finally, she took it and nibbled at the edge. It felt strange how much relief that small act brought him, how much he needed to see her do something ordinary. When she finished the juice, she leaned back against him without a word, and he rested his hand over the curve of her back. He could feel her heartbeat against his palm, steady and fragile all at once. Time stretched in that fluorescent-lit hallway. It struck him how unfamiliar it felt to wait without any clear objective, no milestone to measure success. He was accustomed to urgency, to problems that could be solved by force of will or by signing a check, and this quiet uncertainty, was nothing like any of that. He watched other families come and go, some leaving with relieved smiles, others with slumped shoulders and red-rimmed eyes. Every story seemed to hover around them, reminders of all the hidden struggles taking place in the corners of the world he usually ignored. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged from the clinic's double doors. The woman's face was composed but kind, and she approached slowly as if she knew that sudden movements might startle the small, exhausted girl in his lap. Ryan felt Sophie tense against him and rubbed her shoulder gently. "Mister," the doctor began, and he realized she was unsure who he was to this child. He lifted his chin, answering quietly, "I've been staying with her. She has no one else here." The doctor nodded with a gravity that made something ache low in his chest. "Her mother is stable. She's awake now and asking for her daughter. You can bring her back if you like." He looked down at Sophie, whose eyes had widened at the word "awake," and for the first time that day, he saw a spark of hope break through her fear. She didn't wait for him to stand up, she slid from his lap and reached for his hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He laced his fingers around hers, feeling the slight tremor in her grip, and rose slowly so she could steady herself beside him. As they walked toward the clinic door, her small hand in his, he realized that he hadn't thought once about the flight he was supposed to meet, or the deal that might have slipped away while he was sitting here. He only thought about how it felt to be exactly where someone needed him. The corridor leading to the treatment area was quieter than the rest of the clinic, the walls painted a soft blue meant to be calming. Ryan walked slowly so Sophie wouldn't feel rushed, her small hand still wrapped trustingly around his fingers. Each step seemed to echo in a place deep inside him he hadn't known was empty, a part that had stayed untouched by all the polished accomplishments he had worked so hard to collect. He watched her gaze dart nervously toward each open doorway they passed, as if she feared her mother might have vanished in the time it took them to walk down the hall. The doctor walked just ahead of them, occasionally glancing back to offer a reassuring nod, and every time she did, Sophie's grip on his hand grew a little firmer. They stopped outside a curtained alcove where monitors beeped in slow, steady intervals. Ryan felt the girl hesitate, so he crouched down beside her, steadying her shoulder with one hand. Her wide brown eyes flicked between the curtain and his face, searching for the courage to go forward. He kept his voice low, speaking carefully so she would hear that he meant every word. "She's right in there," he said. "She's going to be so happy to see you." Sophie's mouth trembled, but she nodded, swallowing hard as she stared at the blue fabric that separated her from the only person she had in the world. The doctor slipped inside first, murmuring to the patient, and then she drew the curtain back. Sophie drew in a breath so sharp that Ryan felt it in his own chest, and before he could say anything else, she darted forward, crossing the threshold in 3 small steps. He followed just far enough to see the woman in the bed, pale and exhausted, her hair pulled back from her face, and 4 taped to the back of her hand. When her eyes opened fully and settled on her daughter, they filled instantly with tears. Sophie climbed carefully onto the edge of the mattress and pressed herself against her mother's side. Neither of them spoke, but the relief in that embrace was louder than any words. Ryan felt an ache bloom behind his ribs as he watched them. He knew he should probably step back to give them privacy, but something held him there, rooted to the spot. The woman's gaze lifted over her daughter's head and met his, and he saw how confused she was to find a stranger standing at the foot of her bed. He realized he hadn't even thought of what he would say when this moment came. He cleared his throat, the words clumsy in his mouth in a way that felt almost reassuring, proof that this wasn't just another problem to solve or a crisis to manage. I found her sitting alone in the terminal," he said quietly. "She was very brave." The woman's lips parted, and a sound escaped her, a fragile mixture of gratitude and grief. She pressed her cheek against her daughter's hair and closed her eyes. He felt the doctor step closer to the bed, checking the monitors and giving them both a moment to breathe. Ryan folded his arms across his chest, feeling the stiffness in his back and shoulders that came from sitting in the same chair for hours. But underneath that was something softer, something that felt almost like peace. It occurred to him that this was the first time in a long while he had stayed somewhere simply because someone needed him to, with no expectation of thanks or reward. He wondered why it had taken him so long to learn that was enough. The nurse brought in a chair and placed it by the bed. Ryan thanked her and sat without thinking about how it must look, a man in an expensive suit waiting in a hospital room for a woman he'd never met before today. He rested his forearms on his knees, watching the slow, tentative way Sophie's mother stroked her daughter's hair. Eventually, the woman lifted her head again. Her voice came out raw and uneven. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." He met her gaze steadily, finding that he didn't have any polished response prepared. "You don't have to thank me," he said, and he meant it. "No one should ever have to be alone like that." Sophie looked over her shoulder at him then, and the trust in her eyes nearly undid him. He had never imagined that something as small as being present could matter so much. In that quiet hospital room, with the sound of monitors beeping in time with a child's breath, he realized that whatever happened next, this day would stay with him. It would be the day he finally understood that all his success had never taught him the simplest lesson, that showing up for someone could be more important than anything he had ever built. Ryan stayed in that chair much longer than he intended, though he no longer felt the need to check his watch or think about the hours slipping by. At first, he told himself he was only there to be sure the girl settled safely beside her mother, that he'd leave once he was confident there would be no more emergencies. But as the quiet minutes collected and the room grew dimmer with the approach of evening, he felt the truth settling in his chest. He simply couldn't make himself walk away. He sat with his elbows braced on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, and watched as Sophie dozed with her cheek pressed to her mother's arm. Every now and then, her mother's eyes would flutter open, unfocused, before finding him as if to reassure herself he hadn't disappeared. She looked so exhausted that her voice had dwindled to a hoarse whisper, but even then she kept her hand moving over her daughter's hair in a slow, tender rhythm that made Ryan feel something fracture inside him in the gentlest possible way. He tried not to intrude on their closeness. He told himself he was only a witness to it, a stranger who had been in the right place when a child needed help. But when he saw how the woman's shoulders sagged with relief each time she realized he was still sitting there, he knew he had already stepped past the threshold of polite detachment. He thought of all the years he'd spent carefully drawing boundaries, convinced that keeping his life in strict compartments would protect him from disappointments he couldn't control. Yet nothing about this felt like a mistake. It felt necessary in a way he didn't have language for. When a nurse came in to check the 4-line, she paused by Ryan's chair and asked in a gentle voice if he needed anything, water, coffee, a moment to stretch his legs. He shook his head, surprised by how natural it felt to refuse. He didn't want to leave, not even for a minute. He didn't think Sophie would wake up frightened if she opened her eyes and found her mother here, but some instinct deeper than reason insisted that it mattered for him to remain. He had never believed before that presence alone could be an offering, but in that moment, he finally understood it could. As twilight faded into evening, the doctor returned to update them. The woman, her name, he'd learned, was Claire, was stable enough to be moved out of the treatment area to a regular observation room. When Claire tried to lift her head to protest that she couldn't pay for overnight care, the doctor explained that the airport had a program to cover emergencies like this. Ryan knew that wasn't entirely true. It was the sort of discreet arrangement that happened when someone like him asked for it without fanfare. He felt no urge to correct her. Watching the relief in Claire's face was enough. When the nurse helped Claire sit up a little straighter and guided Sophie to stand on her own, Ryan finally stood too, feeling the stiffness in his legs from hours in the same position. He had expected that he'd feel a surge of awkwardness then, as if he'd overstayed a welcome that had never been formally offered, but Claire lifted her gaze to his with a softness that eased every doubt. "Will you stay a little longer?" she asked in a voice as tentative as her smile. It struck him how humbling it was to be asked. He nodded, though the word came out before he realized he'd spoken. "Of course," he said simply. The nurses arranged a second chair so he could sit again if he wanted. But instead, he found himself standing by the window, looking out over the darkened tarmac. The glow of runway lights in the distance reminded him of all the flights he had missed that day, all the meetings postponed, and he felt nothing like regret. In the reflection of the glass, he could see Sophie settling again beside her mother, the two of them a quiet silhouette of closeness he knew he would never forget. At some point, Sophie turned and caught his eye, her face sleep-softened and calm in a way it hadn't been when he first saw her on that terminal floor. She raised a hand and rubbed her eyes, then looked back at him as though to be sure he was still real. He lifted his hand in a small wave, feeling the absurd tightness in his throat again. For a man who had built his life around never needing anyone, it was a revelation to realize how much it mattered that someone might need him. He stood there as the hours slipped by, and though no one said it out loud, he understood that the decision he'd made was no longer temporary. Whether he admitted it or not, a part of him had already decided he wasn't going to leave their lives behind when dawn came. The next morning arrived in a hush of pale light through the narrow window above Claire's hospital bed, and for the first time in what felt like a very long night, Ryan allowed himself to sit back in the chair and simply breathe. He watched the way the dawn seemed to soften everything in the small room, turning the sharp edges of the medical equipment into something almost gentle. Claire was propped up slightly against the pillows, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale but steadier. She had managed a few sips of water, and the doctor said her vitals were improving. Sophie lay curled beside her, her cheek resting against Claire's side, a thin blanket tucked around them both. Seeing them like that, safe, together, no longer afraid, filled Ryan with a quiet that he couldn't quite name, only feel. He hadn't intended to stay all night, but every time he thought about leaving, he remembered the way Sophie's small hand had gripped his lapel when the nurse first led her into the clinic, the silent plea in her eyes not to be abandoned. So he remained. He drank vending machine coffee that tasted of cardboard and answered polite calls from his office, explaining in clipped sentences that he wouldn't be in today. He didn't elaborate, and to his surprise, no one demanded that he justify why he was sitting in a hospital room with a woman he didn't know. It was as though a line had been drawn in his life between everything that came before this and everything that would come after, and for once, he didn't feel any urgency to cross back to the world he'd spent decades constructing. When Claire woke fully, she watched him across the small space, her expression uncertain. Her voice was still weak, but it held something firmer beneath the gratitude. "You must have somewhere you need to be," she said, almost apologetic, as if she couldn't fathom why he had chosen to stay when no obligation compelled him. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees so he could meet her gaze without any distance between them. "Right now," he said slowly, "this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." The admission surprised even him with its simplicity. It was not a performance, not an attempt to reassure or impress. It was just the plain truth. Claire swallowed, her eyes glistening, and looked down at her daughter's sleeping face. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You've already done more than anyone has ever done for us." He shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." He hesitated, then continued more quietly. "You've given me something too." He didn't explain further because he suspected she already understood. In that room, he wasn't a CEO or a public figure, he was only a man who had discovered how much it mattered to be needed in a way that had nothing to do with profit or ambition. Later, while Claire rested, Ryan took a slow walk with Sophie to the cafeteria. She held his hand without hesitation, chattering in a soft, shy voice about how she had once been on a plane with her mother and how she liked the tiny packets of pretzels they gave out. He listened without interrupting, struck by how quickly the language of trust had formed between them, as if she no longer questioned whether he would be there to hear her stories. When they reached the small cafe counter, he let her choose a muffin and a carton of milk, and she looked up at him with a solemn gratitude that made his chest feel tight. They sat together at a small table near the window. Sophie swung her legs beneath her chair while she ate, her hair falling forward in a silky curtain. He found himself studying the small, ordinary details of her chipped pink nail polish, the way she licked a crumb from her lip, and felt an almost painful ache at the thought of walking away. It occurred to him that this was what his life had been missing, a sense of connection so immediate and unqualified that it made everything else feel pale by comparison. When they returned to the room, Claire's eyes widened a little at the sight of Sophie carrying her muffin in both hands. For a moment, the woman looked between her daughter and Ryan as if trying to reconcile the image of him, this impeccably dressed stranger, with the man who had spent the night by her side and now brought her child back with crumbs on her chin. He saw her trying to understand his motives, perhaps to convince herself this was nothing more than a moment of kindness that would fade when the crisis ended. He wished he could explain how wrong that was, how something had shifted inside him in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't reverse. But instead of offering reassurances he wasn't sure how to say, he took the extra chair the nurse had brought and sat down beside her again. He rested his elbows lightly on his knees and simply remained, showing her with his presence that he wasn't going anywhere. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, he realized it didn't matter if she understood yet. What mattered was that he did. That evening, Ryan stood by the hospital room window, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the tarmac lights. The sky beyond the glass was streaked in mauve and gray, the kind of dusky color that always reminded him of arriving late to meetings in far-off cities. Only tonight, he didn't feel the familiar restless guilt that he wasn't somewhere else, doing something more important. For the first time in his life, he felt perfectly certain he was exactly where he needed to be. The realization was so quiet it almost didn't feel like a revelation at all, more like something that had always been waiting for him to notice. He turned to look back at the bed where Claire was propped on the pillows, Sophie tucked close beside her with a picture book balanced carefully on her knees. The little girl read aloud in a whispery voice, pausing to show each illustration to her mother. Claire watched her daughter with such patient devotion that it made Ryan's throat tighten. She looked tired but no longer afraid. Every so often, she glanced over the top of the book to meet his gaze, as if to check he was still there, and each time he simply nodded. He had no intention of leaving. When the nurse came to check Claire's vitals and straighten the blankets, Ryan stepped closer to the foot of the bed, feeling a slight awkwardness that he couldn't quite shake. He realized he had been here almost 24 hours without ever asking the most basic question: what would happen next? The thought of Sophie being taken somewhere unfamiliar if her mother needed more time to recover sent a cold unease crawling down his spine. As if sensing this, Claire lifted her head and looked at him steadily. Her voice was still rough, but stronger than before. "I don't want her to go anywhere," she murmured, her hand smoothing over Sophie's hair as the little girl rested her cheek on her arm. "I don't want her to think I'm leaving her behind." Ryan hesitated, searching for the right words. He didn't want to overstep. He knew that their connection was fragile, built in a moment of crisis, but he couldn't deny how deeply he felt the need to protect them both. He cleared his throat, feeling the unfamiliar rawness of vulnerability in his own voice. "She doesn't have to leave," he said carefully. "If you need time, if you need someone to help, you can count on me." Claire blinked, and her eyes filled so quickly that she pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. He wasn't sure he'd ever seen such fierce gratitude and sorrow in the same glance. "You don't even know us," she whispered, her voice cracking. He let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything he hadn't said yet. "I know enough," he told her quietly. "I know you've done everything you could to take care of her. I know she's brave because you taught her to be. I know you both deserve more than to be alone." The words sounded too exposed, too honest, but he didn't take them back. For once, he didn't want to be guarded or precise. He only wanted to speak the truth. Claire looked down at Sophie, who had fallen asleep mid-sentence, her hand still resting lightly on the page. She brushed a thumb over the child's cheek and exhaled shakily. "She's all I have," she whispered. Ryan swallowed against the ache that rose in his chest. "Maybe," he said, choosing his words slowly so she would hear how much he meant them, "maybe you don't have to do it all alone anymore." He saw the moment she let herself believe it, even if only for an instant. She looked up again, her eyes shining, and gave a small nod that felt like an agreement he knew neither of them took lightly. A few minutes later, the nurse dimmed the lights and left them alone. Ryan moved his chair closer and sat so that if Sophie woke, he would be the first person she saw. He could feel the quiet settling over them, not the hollow, uneasy quiet of before, but a steadier hush that felt almost like peace. He thought about how strange it was that everything he'd built for himself, his wealth, his reputation, the carefully managed life, had never once made him feel as present and alive as sitting here beside a woman and child who had begun the day as strangers. Eventually, Claire's eyelids drooped, and she gave up trying to stay awake. Sophie shifted in her sleep and rolled toward her mother, her small hand stretching out until it brushed Ryan's knee, as if even in dreams she needed to be sure he hadn't gone far. He rested his palm gently over her fingers, feeling her warmth and the delicate weight of her trust. He sat that way long after both of them had fallen asleep, watching their faces soften in the dim light, and thinking that sometimes life changed not with a grand gesture or a dramatic confession but with a simple choice to stay. In the hush of that hospital room, he finally allowed himself to imagine a future where he never had to leave them behind again. And for the first time, he understood that he wanted nothing more than to belong in it. "I think this ending is beautifully quiet and deeply human. It doesn't rely on a dramatic rescue or a sudden miracle but instead unfolds through small, honest acts of presence and care." What struck me most is how Ryan's transformation isn't about becoming a hero, it's about allowing himself to be vulnerable, to step into someone else's pain without any agenda. The story's power comes from how simple the final choice is: he stays. Not because he has to, or because it makes him look good, but because he wants to belong to something real and unguarded. That kind of commitment feels more moving than any grand romantic gesture. It's rare in fiction, and in life, to see a character choose connection over control in such an unflinching way. To me, this is the happiest ending of all, not that everything is suddenly perfect, but that three people who were alone have found in each other the beginning of a family. And they do it not through promises or wealth, but through the quiet courage of showing up and refusing to leave.